and art making practice focuses on addressing inequity, migration, historical passivity, and cultural recognition in historically marginalized communities. I find it super inspiring that William brings this passion into his practice as an elementary art teacher within the Chicago public school system, as well as within the communities that he works with. So William is currently engaged in collaborative work with the Mobilized Creative Collaborative, Chicago ACT Collective, and Just Seas Artist Cooperative. His current research is focused on developing community-based and culturally relevant projects that center power structures of race, economy, and cultural access in contested spaces. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to William. Yay.
Thank you, Gigi. Uh, Good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here. Um, I want to remind folks if folks are interested, you can change your names and add your pronouns on your video by clicking on the, what is that? Your dots, right? To change, rename yourself. But I want to acknowledge I'm here in Cicero, Illinois, which is just adjacent to Chicago. And I'm in the Aboriginal homelands of several tribal nations, specifically the Council of the Three Fires. So, I want to start today just by acknowledging the fact that, the work that I'm going to present to you is my work, right? But it was made possible by generations of folks working in communities that weren't always necessarily celebrated, right? And their work was instrumental in me learning about what teaching artistry looked like in neighborhoods, and what artist and teaching could potentially look like before I even knew that my teaching was my arts practice and that my arts practice was my teaching. So my name is William Estrada. I'm going to take you through a brief, convoluted, story-like telling, right, of what it is that I do. Most of my work has existed as a teaching artist. I went through art school and received my Bachelor's of Fine Arts in K through 12 education here in Illinois. And at the time, I was really afraid of public schools because I didn't want to deal with the bureaucracy of what I thought could potentially present itself, right? I was really interested in thinking about race, power. I was really interested in thinking about culture. And I was afraid that if I went into a public school, that those conversations would be wouldn't be allowed. And part of the reasoning why I thought that was because when I was doing my student teaching in elementary and high school, I was constantly told that I wasn't teaching art, that really what I was doing was teaching social studies, that I should become a social studies teacher. And I continuously rebutted that argument with social studies is art, history is art, math is art, right? And I learned through many conversations with what was then Prose Art Studio, which was a community organization in Chicago, and Yollocalli Youth Museum, which was part of the National Museum National Museum of Mexican Art here in Chicago as well, as long as El Centro de la Causa, which was an organization that did a lot of activism in the community, and many, many other artists, community artists that have been doing this work for generations, some that are here. And Diana, I want to give you a shout out for all the work that you've been doing, that you have been teaching me and continue to teach me throughout this, through the 20 plus years. But one of the organizations that I was really taught me about what it meant to be vulnerable and transparent when working in community organizations was Prose Arts, and also Art Resources and Teaching, which ended up dissolving in 2012 due to the economy at the time. And what we ended up doing is we really started thinking about how we could partner with schools and be transparent around budgets, be transparent about our goals, be transparent about the things that we wanted to do. And actually, Anthony Rea was part of this conversation as well, with these schools, where we looked at the work of Kara Walker, we looked at the work of Kehinde Wiley, and we ended up developing these portraits. It was a period of about three years that we ended up collaborating with this with 3 schools in the Austin neighborhood here in Chicago. And we really started thinking about stereotypes and places in their neighborhoods that they had been stereotyped, right? Places where they had encountered racism. And these portraits here were 3 layers, right? Like, one layer was around the map of their neighborhood. Another one was a portrait of themselves. And there was text writing about the things that they wanted, that they saw missing in the neighborhood itself. And part of the conversations that I was attempting to have were, how do we get to reclaim the stories that are untold about our neighborhoods? And how do we get to represent the complexities of the spaces that we live in? In this particular portrait, we use the work of Kara Walker, right, and the silhouettes, to think about the stories of where students, this was 3rd graders, where they had encountered racism in their neighborhood, and how could we potentially use art as a way to begin to address and take accountability for the actions that we ourselves take part in when we make assumptions of others. But then also, how do we start engaging in these discussions to begin healing the trauma that we experience as individuals, the trauma that we experience in our neighborhoods, and then the trauma that's experienced as a city. And again, we ended up taking this format of, it's 3 layers of transparency, right? We ended up taking the layer of the map of the neighborhood where this action took place. We ended up writing the story of retelling, and then we ended up using theater of the oppressed, specifically image theater, right, to create tableaus of the actual moment when they had experienced this racist action, and then we resolved it, right? And thinking about what other potential solutions could we generate through these actions. And you see some of these pieces, what we ended up learning was that the students were really interested in engaging in these conversations and engaging in quote unquote adult conversations with other, older people, right? In thinking about what is the responsibility that we take, right? We've been able to do different pieces, specifically for this one. When we started, students in 5th grade asked to learn how to do graffiti, and there was a big uproar from families about what graffiti meant, right? And the fact that we were showing students how to vandalize in the neighborhood. And what we ended up doing was we started reframing these conversations around the lack of access to cultural and art spaces within the neighborhood that didn't allow, right, for young people to really have a space to be to be artists, right, to engage with any sort of public art. And this was one of the first times where I really started thinking about what it would mean for us to create public art in public spaces within schools, right? And started to question the idea of the public school. And I'll show you a little bit more about that later on. And a lot of the work that I started doing, I started working at Tepochcali Elementary, which I was a teaching artist for about 15 years. And I've been the visual arts teacher there for the last 3 years, where I've worked from pre-kindergarten through 8th grade and an after-school program. And Tepochcali taught me to center play in a lot of the work that we were doing. We really started playing around the idea of puppets and telling our own narratives, right? Like, what does culture mean? specifically thinking of Dia de los Muertos, of course, Dia de las Madres, Mother's Day, which is a big celebration in Mexico, just as well as the US, right? And thinking about these particular cultural aspects that for some students, newly arrived students, some of these ideas were new, right? And then some ideas were also, there was also ideas that were repeated, right? And then there was also ideas that were this mix of like Mexican American, right? Like this Americanization of Mexican ideas. So thinking about like, where does culture belong? Who gets to claim culture? Who gets to claim these particular spaces within our neighborhoods? Those projects that I started doing with the 5th grade teacher, where we started mapping our community, right? We started, this was when Google Maps had actually just come out. So we're really excited about like doing virtual tours, right? And we started thinking about what was present in the neighborhood. This was Little Village neighborhood in Chicago, which is the 2nd largest Mexican American concentration folks from Mexican Americans outside of LA. And what we started noticing was the lack of resources that were actually present in the neighborhood. So we actually ended up working with the 5th graders to think about what resources were present in the neighborhood and what resources they would like to see. So begin to start imagining futures for themselves based on, healthy communities, right? What kind of healthy things do we need in our neighborhood in order to make sure that we're healthy, like green spaces, healthcare, what are some of the things that we need in order to be entertained, right? So movie theaters, pools, green fields, right? And things that we needed in order to have healthy food, right? And it's like, don't, like we still want our burgers, right? But we wanted to make sure that we had access to all different sorts of food. And we ended up spending a good, 3-4 months on this project, right? From planning to figuring out like scales to actually like building maquettes. But this is one of the processes where we like really started thinking about creating this space. And this is actually like the Chicago River, that's close to Chicago, and then, Lake Michigan. And of course, like there's constant conversations about like really going out into the neighborhood and thinking about what are the things that are happening in the neighborhood. As you may or may not know, right? Like Chicago's like one of the most segregated cities. So we really started thinking about, what are some of the solutions that we could potentially create in order to address segregation within the city itself, right? And part of these conversations, we would start recreating these stories through shadow puppets, right? Like these are actually kindergartners. And, when we're thinking about segregation, when we're thinking about othering others, right? And when we're thinking about how do we interact with people that we may not know, that we may be taught to fear, right? What are some of the basic principles, that we need to think of when we are attempting to engage with folks. Now, as part of our classes, within the art classroom, we always start with the poem In La Quech. I'm not sure if anybody's familiar with that poem, right? But the premise of the poem In La Quech, which was penned by Luis Valdez, was, in terms of like, you are my other me, right? If I do harm to you, I do harm to myself. And if I love and respect you, I love and respect myself, right? So this interdependency, right? And kind of the basic saying, right? Like, I'm going to treat you the way you want to treat me. Not I'm going to treat you the way you treat me, right? Not that one, but I am going to treat you the way I want you to treat me. And basing these discussions around, what our responsibility to each other, right? So one of the pieces that we've been working on is really thinking about how do we take these larger complex ideas and break them down into smaller pieces. So thinking about all the larger structures that we create, right? Like this was actually a project with a science teacher where we were looking at molecules, right? And the fact that all these different molecules, matter, right, are made up of different pieces, and depending on the way you arrange them, right, you get different things, right? So we ended up taking different materials. Part of it is lack of funding, right? Like we don't have a lot of funding. So it's also like trying to figure out like how do we use materials in the best creative way. So we ended up taking these different materials and use them as metaphors, right? Like how can we potentially create these different things out of basic elements, right? So looking at the table of elements, looking at molecules and matter, how do we take these different pieces to make something new, to make something different? And in this particular case, we did end up looking at molecule structures, and we took the idea of the molecule structures to create like these sculptural pieces that were, and you'll notice like here in like some of the vellum here, we started to try to mimic, right? Like some of the molecules that we saw through these these laboratories that Maestra Elizabeth Pagan in 6th grade was leading the students through, right? And some of the other pieces that we've been working on is really thinking about, the construction of spaces. In this particular program, we ended up working with an elementary school where we took, quote unquote, like these broader words of things that we wanted to be, things that we wanted to become, and things that we wanted to remind students to work towards, right? And we ended up creating these murals, right, of text that then ended up on non-woven fabric that then we ended up installing in the halls of the school itself. Now, this is one of my favorite pieces. I'm not like a trained illustrator, right? Like I don't do comics, but I love using comics as a vehicle to engage in discussions of superheroes, right? Like super people. And one of the projects that I do a lot with students is really thinking about as, if you are the super person in your own comic, right? Who's your villain, right? And in this one, this is one of my favorite ones, right? Where Una is versus the homework packet, right? And that dreaded homework packet, and thinking about, like the things that they do not like to do, right? And Una at this point was in 3rd grade, right? So thinking about the homework packet, there was many other villains as well, right? Like there was the garbage bag, there was the dirty dishes, right? There was like the broom, like all the different pieces of chores that young people are made to do. But we started talking about power, right? We started talking about authority and power dynamics as to what is it that they actually have power over and who has power over them. To have these initial conversations as to, if they were super people, what would they want to change in their own lives, right? And why would they want to change those ideas? Now, we started doing these murals with kindergarten, 1st and 2nd graders. And the reason why we started doing the murals with the K 1st and 2nd was because they were like, Maestro William, you get to do all these murals with the older kids. What about us? We can't wait that long until we get into 6th, 7th, and 8th grade to do these murals. Like we want to do murals now, right? So we started using these. We started using the lessons that they were the K 1st, 2nd grade teachers were doing around nature, right? To draw flowers, to draw buildings and architecture. And we would actually, on non-woven fabric, right? Because it made it a little bit more accessible for these particular grades, to really start thinking about what it meant, for us to engage all the students across all the levels in the elementary school to actually, give them a space in these in a very public way, and it was a learning curve, right? Like I had never really painted, large, murals or, in this case, like murals in this way with such young children. So, thinking about like what that could potentially look like, right? And then the other pieces too is that, we really started looking at, in this particular case, we partner up with, I was doing arts integration with a 6th grade teacher, social studies. to think about the Chilean arpilleristas, right? And the arpilleristas coming together in women's circles in order to address the dictatorship of Pinochet, right? And in that case, we were also learning about the US involvement in Latin America in the many coups to destabilize Latin America. And in this case, we started thinking about the arpilleristas, how they were coming together, not only to address the trauma that they were experiencing, but also as a way to create these networks of young women, right? Of older women, of women that were being left behind by los desaparecidos, that Pinochet was disappearing, and really thinking about these particular pieces of these women's circles as healing circles, right? And the fact that women's work is not always appreciated, it's undervalued, it continues to be undervalued, right? And the fact that because they were sewing, right, they were, and the US had very much a play in this, right? The US really didn't, folks in the US didn't really hear about what was happening, right? These arpilleras actually ended up having to go to Canada for the world to pay attention. So, but we learned about the arpilleristas' work, and we really started thinking about things that are happening now, right? Like what is disappearing now? And we've done this project in 2 versions, right? Like the first one, we did it in early 2000 when we started thinking about immigration and thinking about folks being deported, especially here in Chicago. There was a lot of raids by INS at that time. And in this particular piece, like this student is actually thinking about gentrification, right? And the displacement of people from neighborhoods from the gentrification that's happening in Chicago, right? And then this is actually arpillera that was created by a 7th grader, where they were talking about, in this particular piece, we ended up doing arpilleras that would document why people leave their homes, the different ways that people come to the US, right? And then the realities that people encounter when they're in the US already. And part of this was also as a way for us to create counter narratives as to what immigrants look like and what undocumented folks look like within the US and how they've arrived in the US as well. For this particular project, we were also looking at the work of Bianca Diaz, which is an illustrator here in Chicago. She does these beautiful, beautiful portraits of, she's an amazing illustrator, but in this particular piece, we were looking at the portraits that she does of people's homes and thinking about what is a home, right? Like what are the characteristics of a home and what are the things that make a home, right? The sounds, the food, the smells. And this was in particular looking at, again, using Google Maps as a way for us to document the different types of homes in Chicago. And then also thinking about, designing your own homes, right? With the kindergarten teacher, right? Like we ended up, we do a May Day, but because this is Chicago and, folks are really afraid of labor movements, and we're not afraid, and we're not that we're not afraid, but we're not allowed, to do May Day celebrations. We do a Workers' Day celebration, right? Where we do these large scale puppets to think about the workers that live in the neighborhood, right? We end up creating different types of puppets, large puppets with the kindergartners and the 1st graders, and I think the 2nd graders as well. And what we end up doing is we end up getting blank shirts, and on the shirts themselves, we end up documenting all the types of workers that the students have a relationship with, right? And we start studying the workers and like what a union is. And then what we do is we do a parade, right? A celebration across the school where the kindergartner and the kindergarten teacher and Ms. Jennifer Klonsky and Maestra Marisol Ceron, very graciously lead us through chanting on worker rights. So what we started realizing is that, I work in a really, really amazing school, but the school isn't, we just don't have the budget to upkeep it, right? So there's a lot of cracks, there's a lot of peeling paint. And what we started realizing was that with a lot of administrative support, we realized that, we had a lot of access to spaces, right, that we could potentially paint. Now, because again, students, young students are constantly telling me, like, why don't they get to paint where the big kids paint? We started really thinking about, what potential spaces within the school are often ignored, right? So we started painting in the sidewalks and really thinking about, those public ways where we don't necessarily think about those spaces as spaces that are public and could potentially, we could potentially make public art. In this particular piece right here, right, like we also started looking at the trees themselves. We have, we're next to a boulevard, which is not really green space. We're not allowed to use that as green space within the neighborhood, but it's the largest green space in the neighborhood because it's considered a median, that divides traffic. So what we started to do is really started thinking about, painting these trees as ways to bring attention to the green space itself, and also to think about, like, well, if we can't use this to play in, right, like where else can we play in as well? These particular pieces were around honoring invisible labor in the neighborhood, right? So again, thinking about the workers and thinking about, what kind of work exists in the neighborhood. And then this particular piece, again, was in order for us to create posters and postcards around immigration, right? And the different ways that people migrate. So I'm gonna move on a little bit because I want to get to a couple other pieces. We have some pieces here where we're looking at ecosystems, right? And imagining students as those, as Illinois, like endangered species, right? And or species that we find in our neighborhood, and thinking about like a day in the life of this particular species to really help students imagine what they could potentially be. And of course, right, like doing like some animation and some puppet work, some paper puppet work around illustrating stories. Now, one of the pieces that I've really been enjoying is that, I've been focusing a lot on printmaking, and we do a lot of exploration. There's a lot of space for for exploration. And one of the things that we started doing was really thinking about screen printing, right, with slip in order to actually do it on clay as well, right? This is one of my favorite projects. We really started thinking about, in response to gentrification and the buildings that that exist in our neighborhood, we worked with a science teacher that was already teaching solar energy, renewable energy, and we started reimagining buildings in the neighborhood. And we actually used the work of Nicole Marroquin, where Nicole Marroquin actually ends up doing collages of neighborhoods, and she's been doing that with high school students, elementary school students. And what we did is we took these pictures of existing buildings and created these blueprints of what these buildings could potentially look like in the future, right? We ended up creating blueprints or planos based on the needs that students saw in their family, and then created water systems, using gray water, reclaimed water, rainwater, and also thinking about using like solar and wind energy, right? And of course, like we all had, like most of the places had video games, video game rooms. We also had like soccer fields on the roof, right? And like garden spaces. And then we also talked about, right, like, well, if we're gonna have these spaces, what could they potentially look like, right? And then we actually ended up creating maquettes based on these spaces for us to like imagine what these homes could potentially look like. And that little tiny, like rectangle that you see, that's actually a scale of a city lot, right, in Chicago. Right. So the thing was that like you could not build these large mansions, right? Like you had to work within the lots that are pre-existing in the neighborhood. This piece, we ended up doing soft sculptures, right? Like to think about cells, to think about viruses and bacteria. This little yellow one here is like a cancer cell. This is a white blood cell. Can't remember the other two. But what we ended up doing is we ended up studying cells, right? We created comics to give them life and to think about like what it is that they do, how it affects people's lives. But we also started thinking about the complexities of their existence, right? It's like the cancer cell does a lot of damage, right? So how does it live with itself, knowing, right, that it does a lot of damage to the body, right? And like how does it come to how does it come to, you know, accept the work that they do when they have like no power in changing that, or do they, right? Like, and asking those kind of questions as to, you know, like what makes a bacteria good, what makes it bad, right? And having those complex conversations, right? This is a current printmaking class that I'm teaching at UIC right now. It's called Collaborative Resistance Print Shop. And what we end up doing is we end up taking research that is put out by the Institute for Research on Public Race and Public Policy, that is housed in UIC, and we turn that research into visual images, right? So these are like proofs of like some of the work that we've been doing. This was on thinking about the exodus of Black folks here in Chicago that has been happening since the early 1970s. And the different factors that play into the exodus of that, right? And right now I'm teaching this printmaking class again, and the new research just came out on the racial wealth gap that exists in Chicago, right? So thinking about research and how do we visualize that research through, in this case, in printmaking. So these are some particular pieces. Now, the thing, you know, I really love teaching, and I really love teaching in school, but after school has been this completely different place that, you know, one, you know, this is at the Hyde Park Art Center of Chicago, where, and also like the Chicago Arts Partnership and Education, which Gigi and I worked with, and I continue working with them. And I've been doing an after school program with Kate for the last like 15 years, where we've taken these ideas of research and had students, artists, and teachers research potential ways of working with each other, right? And what we end up doing is we say, what do you ever want to learn about, right? That you may or may not know how to do, right? And like, how can we do this together, right? And those questions are both for students, is for the artist, and for the teacher, right? So thinking about all of us as researchers. So everything that we're told that, you know, we cannot do with like, you know, 7-year-olds, we're like, let's try it and see if it happens, if that 7-year-old is also interested in doing that with us, right? So we've been doing stencils using water-based, you know, spray paint, because like students are really interested in graffiti, right? This is actually in another program. This was actually through art research and teaching, but students were really interested in thinking about, you know, creating public art in the hallways, right? So we started looking at silhouettes to recreate different pieces. For this one, students were really interested. This was actually like fourth grade through sixth grade. And students were really interested in figuring out how to do screen print. So we literally set up like these do-it-yourself, you know, shops in the classroom where we learn how to do that kind of work, right? And we let them do everything, right? Like you can see this messy screen printing piece here, you know, where they're like, am I doing it right? You know, it's like, it kind of looks like you're doing it right, but just keep doing it and see what happens, right? But there's these constant explorations as to the possible ways that we can collaborate together. This is actually in a project in Merida, Yucatan, with the Habla Center for Language, where again, we ended up doing screen printing and actually taking these pieces with students, where we walked across the neighborhood, right, to actually place this work out in the public, in the streets, right? these are some other prints that I've created with students in high school. Or, well, I haven't created, they created them. But again, in thinking about where can artwork potentially exist out in public spaces, right? And thinking about, what are some of the ways that we can, at least for me, like how is it that I can really start thinking about the work that we do in schools, right? And the work that I've been able to do in after school. And I was really interested because a lot of these conversations that I was having with students, I was having a hard time having these conversations with adults outside of, school, right? And this is where some of my practice as an artist started emerging. Now, in all transparency, right? Like my work, when I went into art school, my plan was like to become an artist, right? Like teaching kind of happened by accident, right? I completely fell in love with teaching, right? Because it gave me the language to tell my own story and to tell the story that I saw wasn't being told in the neighborhoods that I grew up in, right? In neighborhoods very similar to the ones that I teach in right now, right? And we were having really amazing conversations, sometimes very painful conversations about what it meant to be an artist within the neighborhoods that we exist and live in, right? And what I realized was that, as much pain that exists, there's a lot of joy as well, right? And there's a lot of um, a lot of sense of belonging to know that other people are thinking about this, that other people are acknowledging, right, the potential monuments that we could build for the people that go unnoticed, that go unsung, right? And what I started thinking about is like, well, how can we move this work from outside of the four walls that I was constantly teaching in out into the public space, right? So we started painting in the trees, we started painting in the sidewalks, right? And as an artist, right, I started thinking about how is it that my culture becomes commodified, right? And people want my culture, but not necessarily the people that come with it. So I started wanting to engage in these public conversations, right, outside of the school, right, the institution, and out into the public sphere, right, with folks that might not necessarily see themselves as artists, with folks that might not necessarily see themselves or are connected to education, right? And I started having these street workshops in the early 2000s, right? And thinking about what are the places that we need, right, to laugh, to talk, to listen, to think. Do those places exist, right? And if they do, who has access to them? Who feels welcomed within those spaces, right? And then thinking about, there's a long history of murals, right? There's a long history of printmaking that does this work. There's a long history of community art that does this work, right? And thinking about giving ownership and giving myself permission, right, to engage in these discussions outside of teaching and embracing my teaching as my art making in public spaces, right? So thinking about how do we make birdhouses and think about migration, think about the fact that birds create nests out of, material that they find in the region where they're creating their nest, right? Like, what does it mean that people just like birds migrate in groups at times and find community, build community, right? And using these ideas of metaphors to create these potential spaces for deeper discussions, right? And they're temporal. This particular piece was, I ended up buying 80 shirts, right? Like folks wanted a shirt that says Little Village Love. And we ended up, setting up a table out in the street and just giving away shirts and asking people if they were interested in potentially screen printing these shirts, right? Now, from those conversations and a conversation that I had with my mother about us migrating so much and the fact that we didn't have tons of photographs in our family, because like, man, it was a dream to go to J.C. Penney, to go to those Sears portraits, to get those family portraits, but we could not afford it, right? So I started having this conversation and I ended up applying to the Awesome Foundation. I don't know if there's a chapter in New Mexico, but you should check out the Awesome Foundation, because the Awesome Foundation gives $1,000 a month to any project that they consider awesome, right? So I applied for funding to get a printer to do this mobile photo studio, right? And literally it's like out in the street, right? Like I try and figure out how to get power, and then I photograph folks, and print out family portraits. Originally, we started printing 13 by 19 portraits because that's really what I wanted, right? And then when I would print them to people, they're like, well, what am I supposed to do with this? Right? Like, this is too big. Why can't you just give me like an 8 by 10, right? So I started printing 8 by 10 images, but thinking about, who gets to claim neighborhoods as their own, who gets to tell their own stories, and also the fact that now people have, even though we have tons of images, right? Not everyone has access to actual physical archival images themselves, right? And thinking about these particular potential spaces, right, where people can share their stories, photographs, these photographs are taken and people now have this archival image that gets to claim their space within that particular time, and really thinking about who gets to tell their own stories, right? The fact that they will be able to tell and share these stories with whoever they choose through these images themselves, right? These are they always usually happen outside. Sometimes they do happen inside, right? In this case, last year or pre-COVID, right? Like I actually invited people to invite me to their homes, and we set up in their front yard. This is actually Vanessa Salcedo. She invited me to her home. We set up in her front yard, and then we actually went into different into the neighborhood, right? Like to actually knock on people's doors in the neighborhood and ask them, right? Invite them. And of course, using social media. I really use a lot of social media for a lot of my projects, right? And then this is her and her mother, right? Like this is an image that I ended up taking for these particular pieces, right? So from these street workshops, in 2015, I was given the opportunity by 3Arts Foundation, a local arts organization here in Chicago that supports women, women artists, artists of color, and also artists with disabilities, to dream up of a project. And I really wanted to create this mobile street art cart, in honor of the tianguis that I grew up in Mexico, right, in Tonalá, in honor of the mobile vendors that we see here in Chicago and across many neighborhoods of the US and across the world, right, to use it as a way to create artwork that was related to movement art, right? So button making, stickers, screen printing, posters, banners, right? And engaging people in their neighborhoods, where I physically go into a neighborhood with this cart, I set it up, and I make art with folks, right? For the screen prints, they're usually prompts based on whoever has invited me to the neighborhood. I don't go into neighborhoods that I'm not invited into, right? And what I end up doing is I end up thinking about, what conversations are people having, and then how can I create a poster? How can I create a patch? How can I create a tote bag? Chicago ended up creating a tax on plastic bags to get rid of them. But of course, right, like the folks that get taxed the most are like, marginalized communities. So I ended up just buying a bunch of tote bags and go and give them away, right? All these are completely free, right? And part of it is for folks in neighborhoods that aren't usually seen, right, as filled with creativity, to take ownership of the creativity that's already present and amplify it through the work that we do, right? This was actually, we were doing sugar skulls for Day of the Dead in relationship to the fact that, like, there are sugar skulls in Chicago, but they're pretty expensive, right? Like one tiny sugar skull will be like $5 to $10, right? Where it can cost me $5 to $10 to make about 100, right? So, in thinking about, how do we share these resources, and in the process, then also talk about Day of the Dead, right? Thinking about how do you build your own altar and use it as a vehicle to engage with people in discussion around how art and art education can play a role in organizing and mobilizing within their neighborhoods, respective neighborhoods, right? This was in response to 50 schools that were closed here in Chicago, and thinking about how strong schools equal strong communities. So how schools and the schools being closed in predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods, how that also destabilizes the neighborhood that they're in, right? Because it forces people to move and travel longer distances across the city, which is presented as equitable, right? Because then everyone has access to good schools. And the argument was, well, we want good school in the neighborhood that I live in. I don't want to have to go to a good school in a neighborhood that is not my own, right? So thinking about those pieces, and again, like how do we engage in these deeper discussions with a larger public through these very, temporal things that by themselves, they might be insignificant. They might be a little kitsch, right? They might be like, that design's not that great, William, right? But together, and I fully admit that too, right? Like sometimes it's like, it's okay, but we're gonna put it out because we need to have a conversation, but together, right? Like it's all the pieces together that make it more powerful, right? So, and part of these is also the collaboration, right? Like I love collaboration, right? Whether it's with young people or whether it's with people that I will never ever get to talk to again, it's those conversations about really thinking about what it is that's happening in people's neighborhoods. What does it mean to engage in these conversations and to make in ways that are very public in an ethical way that allows for myself as an artist, as a teacher, to grow and to be more conscious of the conversations that I need to have in my classroom, the conversations that I need to have in my community, but also I invite the people that are having those conversations with me as to what their responsibility in creating these actions look like, how these actions will actually look like in their neighborhoods itself, right? Like this was actually last year, right, with the Chicago strike, and thinking about these potential pieces, right? Like these are, posters that we just ended up creating that just says resist, right? But thinking about what are we resisting and what is resistible, right? And what is it that you're responding to? And these pieces always become this conversation between myself and the person that's engaging in this particular piece, right? So my children are also a big part of the work that I do, right? Like sometimes by force, sometimes out of interest. But one of the things that I end up doing is really thinking about these particular pieces. Now, because Chicago has, seasons, right? Like I'm only able to do this work during, usually I end up doing this work between May and November, depending on whether Chicago loves us that year or not. It's like, so in the winter, right? Like I started imagining what this potential thing could be that I do in winter. And this is where like the radical print shop was born, right? It started at Holman Square, which is in North Lawndale neighborhood, and it's part of the residency from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Then it moved into the P.O. Box Collective, which is in Rogers Park, which is a collective of multiple stakeholders that took over an old post office, right? And now it's actually going to live at the Hyde Park Art Center because that's where I'm there as an artist in residence for the year until until the end of this year, right? And part of it was like, how can I invite activists, right? Like, how can I invite other folks that are interested in using printmaking as a way to organize in these discussions, right? To teach them how to printmake, in a very rudimentary way, right? Where they don't need any presses, they don't need any exposure units. Everything is like, we build everything from scratch, right? To think about like what are some of the things that we can do, when we're at home, right? Because like not everyone has access to a print shop. Now, in all transparency, right? Like the Hyde Park Art Center has a beautiful print shop, right? And they can have access to that. And I encourage them to take classes, right? To learn like that way of doing it. but that's not what I'm there to teach, right? Like I'm teaching like this, you set up 2 tables, right? Like you're gonna set up 2 tables. This is actually my other child, he's my youngest one, doing work around support rent control. And thinking about, like what is it that we could potentially use in order to set up these burning stations, with 2 chairs and like a broom, right? And like the minimal pieces that you might need in order to do that. And right now I'm trying to figure out like how to build like mobile burning units that will actually store screen prints and actually like burn things on the spot. And we'll have like a table that go out so you can actually have the screen and actually burn on that too, but that's hopefully that'll be coming like in the summer and closer to fall. But that's like in the design process. So now, so I'm just one person, right? With like teaching. And like, I've realized, right? Like I don't have much of a social life, because like my teaching is just like the thing that I do. So, Sarah Atlas, which works at Marwin, a Marwin Foundation, she, they do arts programming here in Chicago. We were talking, is like, how can we have more of a social life with people in the world, right? Like, because like we're just working all the time, and I don't know if that's good or bad. That's a whole other conversation, right? But we're like, let's start this collective of like folks that we just want to hang out with. We can make art, right? We can make movement art, and we can hang out, right? So we invited folks, right, that were doing that work already, and folks that were like, like who's actually going to respond to our email, right? It's like we ended up sending out like 30 emails, right? And like maybe about 18 people responded, and probably around 12 people like stuck around after like the first couple of initial meetings, right? So right now there's like about 15 of us, that, from different things, right? Musicians, administrators, folks are doing foundation work, others are teachers, different folks. And we get together, we camp, right? Like those are our getaways, right? Those are our retreats. But we also, do call outs, right, to folks to say like, hey, whatever grassroots, whatever printing you're doing, if you're a grassroots organization, right, like give us a call. We'll help you make that stuff, right? So we've gone through the process, right? Like here for the group here in Chicago that was organizing when the families from the Yotinapa murders were coming to Chicago to talk about what was happening, right? They asked for if anyone could help with shirts, so we ended up printing shirts. We ended up doing a zine on the lead in the Chicago water, and literally like we started this project in spring. And then that's when like that summer, that's when like the all news broke out on the lead in the Chicago water. So we just ended up putting that out, right? And then like other folks, right? Like this is actually a high school group at of DACA students in a high school group that were like, hey, we're interested in learning how to print, can you show us how to print? This is our logo. So we ended up going in to print, right? We were also doing interviews, on how gentrification was affecting people in the neighborhood, right? And this was part of that project we at Fiesta del Sol, which has been an ongoing community celebration in the Pilsen neighborhood. We were invited to set up a station where we photographed by the folks that were organizing the art tent. And then of course, right, like thinking about like how can we use movement art, right, puppets, posters to support some of the work that was already happening, right? And then of course, like sometimes it's just like things that are happening where we can actually generate images to engage people in discussions, right? And this right here was actually a discussion on oh my goodness, I can't remember the name of the campaign right now, where they were talking about Housing Action Illinois was working to make sure that everyone, for returning citizens that had just been released from incarceration, had access to homes, and they're trying to pass legislation, lobbying to pass legislation for folks to remove the previously incarcerated, right, or from the applications on home rentals and home things like that, right? So it's another piece for the Poor People's Movement that was happening, Poor People's Army that was happening here in Chicago. And of course, we ended up partnering with the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization that does a lot of work around environmental justice, specifically at the site Hilco, where there was an implosion this summer at the beginning of COVID, where it actually covered the whole Little Village neighborhood with dust particles from an old coal plant, an energy plant. And we ended up projecting onto other buildings because they ended up lighting their buildings so we can project on theirs. So we just, use the surrounding areas to do that, right? And then part of the other piece is, I'm also part of the Mobilized Creative Collaborative, which is made up of 4 of us. This is Akil Charlton, which does the mobile music box. And he uses recycled materials to do music. This is Andres Lemes Spant, and then Mario Spant Lemes. There's Mario Spant Lemes, there she is. They have the Franken toy mobile and now the drum machine or the noise machine, which is this one right here. And literally Andres is a fabricator, right? So he takes this mobile, all our pieces are pedal powered. And of course I have the mobile street art car, but we formed this collaborative in order to make together and also to think about how do we think about what mobile making can look like across the neighborhood, right? And I know Albuquerque has tons of artists that are doing this work, and hopefully I'll someday I'll get to go and play with you all. And then the Just Seeds Artist Cooperative, which I'm a new member to, right? The Just Seeds Artist Cooperative is a co-owned workers space, right? Of 30 artists from Canada, the US, and Mexico. And some of the work that I've been doing is, I was brought in by Aaron Hughes, which is a printmaker here in Chicago, and thinking about the work that we've been doing already here in Chicago, or the work that I was interested in doing, and then expanding it to a more national level, right? And of course, Just Seeds, I'll be honest, I was a complete fanboy, right? Of Just Seeds, right? They were one of the groups, that in the early 2000s when they started, they justified a lot of the work that I was doing, right? And that I was interested in doing. So for me, it was a complete dream, right? To be what? You want me to be you want me to make with all the people that I've admired for the last 15 plus years, right? And thinking about, this was the Yakima workers, right, in Oregon when they were striking for a couple of cents more, right? There were apple pickers and thinking about that, and they actually ended up winning the strike they were, or the demands that they wanted to take, right? this was part of the strike that was happening not only here in Chicago but across the nation against McDonald's and McDonald's workers wanting to unionize. This was in preparation last year for voting, and this was actually Voces de la Frontera out of Milwaukee that was organizing these voting, right? Folks signing up for registration to vote for Vocero, right? And these were 2 posters that were generated for that particular piece. This was in response to the protests that were happening, right? And the revolution, right? That was happening last year around the Black Lives Matter, and also just the Black violence that we were witnessing as a nation, for so many generations, right? But that came to a boiling point last summer with the murder of George Floyd, which again, it's on the news right now, right? With everything that's happening, but also thinking about brown folks, right? Brown folks and our internalized anti-Blackness, within the Mexican community specifically, right? And thinking about our relationship to white supremacy, right? And you know, like yeah, the way in which we attempt to reach the American dream by embracing white supremacy, right? Um, this was a piece that's going to be released soon by the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture around the People's WPA, right? Like transforming society towards a more just and equitable future. So this was a digital illustration. This was one for Earth Justice that I just generated through Just Seeds. These are some for the National Education Association, NEA, that will be put out sometime soon. These aren't even released. They just literally got created in the last like 2-3 weeks. And then this one, because we realized a lot of people are already going into school. So I was like, oh, I need to change the message. You know, it's like, I was like, oh, we're not your parents. It's like, I still like it though. But, you know, I ended up changing it to teachers and students are essential, right? Like support schools every day, not just when it's convenient for our policymakers. And then these are some images that I'm literally working on right now. You know, like I just burned screens. You know, I just took them to the studio this morning, and hopefully in the next few days I'll make some time to actually print and then put them out, right? But Brilliant Together, Libertad para Todos, Freedom Dreams, and then White Supremacy Kills. You know, and a lot of these designs, what I end up doing is like, I'll have a couple of versions of these and then I'll put them on social media and ask like, hey, this is what I'm thinking. This is the message that I'm trying to get across, right? Like, what are your thoughts on this? What do you think? Where do you think this should be? Where do you think this should exist? Right. And particularly for this one, right? Like after folks voted on this one, this was like one of 3 versions that I shared. Actually, Jen de los Reyes reached out to me and she's like, William, as an educator, like you need to have a footnote, right? You need to have a footnote as to how people can learn about their, you know, disrupting, right, their own white supremacy and acknowledging it. And also like, how do we start healing it, right? So we ended up including, you know, resources as part of these conversations. And that is it. But let's dream together.